All right. Hello all, and welcome to this seminar titled Nationalism between Neoliberalism, Identity Politics, and Populism. My name is Joanna, and I will be chairing today's talk. For today's seminar, we are delighted to have with us Professor Erik Storm, or in Dutch, Erik Storm. Erik Storm is a senior lecturer and associate professor in general history at Leiden University. His investigations focus on the history of regionalism and nationalism from a comparative perspective. Among his publications are The Culture of Regionalism, Art, Architecture and International Exhibitions in France, Germany and Spain, 1819 till 1939, and Nationalism, A World History, published by Princeton in 2024. He also co-edited with José Manuel Núñez Seixas, Regionalism and Modern Europe, Identity Construction and Movements from 1890 to the Present Day, with Stefan Berger, Writing the History of Nationalism, and with Joep Leersen, World Fairs and the Global Molding of National Identities, International Exhibitions as Cultural Platforms, 1851-1958, published by Brill in 2022. So for your information, Erik Storm will talk will take around 30 to 40 minutes, and after that there will be enough time for your questions. So please note that this seminar will be recorded, so it would be great if you could mute yourself and switch off your camera unless you're talking. So now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Storm.
Okay, thank you, Johanna, for the kind introduction, and also Marco and Loughborough for inviting me. So let's see. Yeah, so I switched to my PowerPoint. So today I will be talking about this topic. So nationalism between neoliberalism, identity politics, and populism. So which is basically the last chapter of my book, which was published last autumn by Princeton University Press. And there is already a Dutch edition, which was even appeared slightly before the English original. And next autumn, there will be a Spanish translation as well. So during the talk, I will mostly focus on the last chapter, but I would like to first briefly discuss the setup of the book. So first of all, there were a few issues I had with the state of the art in the field of nationalism studies. So one major issue was that most studies on the history of nationalism, they focus on ethnically or culturally defined nations, so ethnos instead of demos. But as Ernest Gellner already said, there are over 7,000 languages, and so 7,000 potential culturally defined nations, but there are only 200 states. And of these 200 states, there is only a small minority that is also ethnically and culturally homogeneous. So there is a profound mismatch between the potential number of culturally defined nations and the actual existing nation state. So I'm much more in favor, or I think the demos type of nation is much more important than the ethnos type. And I added a picture of the World Cup. I think this picture is from 2016. And we see here the fans of Cameroon that cheer their national team. So this is one of the most visible expressions of nationalism in today's world. But what is presented at World Cups is not nations, but it is states that participate. So Cameroon, for instance, has over 200 ethnic groups, and there are over 200 languages spoken in the country. So what unites all people from Cameroon is that they they are the community of citizens of Cameroon. So it's a demos type of nationalism that is important here. And so a second issue that I have with the existing literature was that there is a very strong focus on nationalist activists and nationalist movements. And most studies largely ignore geopolitical context and transnational trends. And as Andreas Wimmer has shown, new nation states come into being largely because of a broad geopolitical window of opportunity. And this is also what becomes clear in the story of my own book. Then there is a third issue that the traditional view on nationalism really is very teleological, so that a modern nation state inevitably substitutes outdated empires. But if we look at the situation, for instance, in the 19th century, we see that most early nation states also were empires. And moreover, most dynastic empires, most traditional empires showed a lot of nationalizing tendencies. So nation states and empires are not opposites, but are closely entangled. So that gives a very different perspective. Then I think someone has the mic open. Okay, yeah. Then there is a fourth issue that I have is that traditionally, and for instance, in Hobsbawm's short overview of the history of nationalism, it is really presented as something that arises in the West and is then exported to the rest. So it arises in Western Europe and the Americas, then goes to Eastern Europe, and only in the 20th century arrives to Asia and Africa. But this ignores that the world was already very much connected in the 18th century. So what I discovered was that the nation model, at the moment that it was invented during the Age of Revolutions, was already admired and imitated around the globe. So this provides also, gives a very different, much more global story of the rise and evolution of nationalism. And then a fifth issue is methodological nationalism. So most case studies, especially those from historians, are very inward looking, focus on domestic actors and factors. And I wanted to get away from that. So I do not pretend that all cases are unique, but I really focus on what is similar. So the international patterns and trends on the interaction that is way more important than can be found in most existing case studies. But still, I'm a historian, so I adopted a chronological approach. So the first chapter deals with early conceptions of nationhood, so really from the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And then almost all chapters deal with a period of about 30 to 40 years with quite well-known and obvious turning points like the First and the Second World War. But within these chapters, I have a thematic approach. So my main argument is that we have to study the rise of new nation states, which are largely based on the demos type of nation, as something different from the evolution of nationalist ideas and practices, which are mostly based on the ethnic type of nation. The first two sections deal with the nation state model, and the second, the third and the fourth aspect deal with more the ethnos type of nationalism. So I start each chapter with the creation of new nation states in this period. So really looking at the geopolitical context and the windows of opportunity that arise. Then what does it mean to be member of a nation state? So that this is about citizenship. So processes of exclusion and inclusion connected to the new nation state. Then the third section deals with the impact of nationalism on high culture and on the social sciences and humanities. And then the last section deals with the nationalization of the physical environment. So statues, monuments, museums, but also the nationalization of food and clothing, but also the creation of national parks. So how nationalism really dominated our entire everyday life. So the original title of the book was also Nationalizing the People. So in the end result of my book is that I really describe the rise and evolution of nationalism as a global process that went to very similar phases all around the world. I really also side with the modernist interpretation and therefore reject the anti-modernist interpretation of Smith and Asargat or Kaspar Hirschi. So they argue that there is a strong continuity between early modern and modern myths, symbols, and narratives, but this is a typical form of historicism. So explain society by studying its roots. And so this is also very strongly a form of methodological nationalism, with which I do not agree. Then I also nuance the classical modernist interpretation. So I put a lot of emphasis on that the nation really is, or the nation state really is, a consequence of a political revolution. So the American and especially the French Revolution and the ramifications that it had were really crucial. So I put much less emphasis on economic or cultural modernization. And so the nation, in my view, first of all, is a legal concept. It is the community of citizens, the demos, and this is much more important in practice than the ethnos version of nationalism, which I also discuss in the book, but which gets less attention. Then the nature of nationalism changes profoundly over time, and this is not a unilinear process of modernization, for instance, but there are a lot of unexpected twists and turns. And I think nowadays with Donald Trump, we are seeing a new, very unexpected twist. I now come to my last chapter, and so initially, I started my last chapter with the obvious turning point in recent history, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and the disappearance of communism. So this led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, to the Yugoslav wars, genocide in Rwanda, so a lot of new nation states, and fierce nationalism and ethnic violence returned. So this was where I initially started, but in the end I decided to rewrite my last two chapters because I found out that 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, probably was a much more profound turning point. And so what we see here is that in the preceding decades, modernization and development had been very important. And what we see here is really a return to or the rise of a modern form of identity politics. Here in the center, we see a clergyman with a megaphone leading a protest, and we see a lot of traditionally clothed religious women that protest in the street. So it is a return to tradition, but it's also very novel because traditional women protesting in the public sphere is something unheard of, and the same is true for clergy men taking on a very political role. But in order to understand this, the rise of identity politics and this shift in nationalism, we have to go back to the 1950s and 60s. And so what we see after the end of the Second World War in 1945 is that racism, fierce nationalism, and imperial expansion became taboo after the defeat of Nazi Germany and imperial Japan. So there was a very clear break with the 1930s and 40s. And the emphasis in the 1950s and 60s, both in the West, in the communist East, and in the Third World, was on social modernization and economic development. And the emphasis, for instance, in cities was very much on racial planning and modern architecture. And so this fundamentally transformed the way cities looked like. And probably the most emblematic example is Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil, designed and built by the two most important modernist architectures of the country. And so it was built in the center of the country in the rainforest, and building materials had to be transported there by airplane. The entire city was really built around highways, so transportation needed to be done largely by car. All people living in the same 6-story high-rise concrete buildings, functionalist architecture everywhere, and even the street names received a number. So there was no reference in the street names to the history, to the country. So this city could have been built anywhere. And only the name of the new capital referred to the country. And so cities became much more similar all around the world because of the rise of modern architecture and these planning practices. But maybe even more profound was the revolution that happened at the same time at the countryside. So the so-called Green Revolution, so the invention of new miracle crops for grain, maize, rice, really raised productivity a lot. But this was accompanied by a mechanization of agriculture. So agriculture almost became an industrial activity. So larger plots, monoculture as well. And also the buildings in the countryside became functionalist buildings. So the countryside throughout the entire world became much more similar than it had ever been. And so national identities, in a way, became much less important during this period. On the other hand, over time, the nation state really became hegemonic. But this was a relatively slow process. So we tend to think of decolonization as a quick change from colonial empires to independent nation states, but most colonial empires really tried to create more egalitarian commonwealths or units in unions in a way to preserve empire in a different, more egalitarian form. And on the other hand, there were also a lot of attempts, especially also by politicians from the colonies themselves, to create larger federations because they thought that their state would be very vulnerable in the international arena. And it's only in the early 1960s that both these unions and federation largely fail, and that the nation state really becomes the model for all new states. So the hegemony of the nation state, in fact, is a very recent phenomenon. And within these nation states, both in the West, in the East, in the Third World, was very much on assimilation. So ethnic and cultural differences were not emphasized, but everybody had to learn the new national language and got a very uniform education. So everybody was expected to become part of the new nation. And this was strongly encouraged also by the new mass media, radio and television. Both are territorially based, so you cannot receive, well, radio still can go over borders, but television, it's much more difficult. So this really created a national public sphere and really the imagined communities that Anderson writes about. So it reached a much larger audience than traditional written media. And what happened is not that the knowledge of the national language became diffused throughout the space of the nation state, but even the right way to pronounce it. So BBC English is famous for that, but this happened throughout the entire world. So a uniform standardization of language and national identities. And then in the late 1960s and 70s, we see a slow shift towards something different and the rise of identity politics. And it's basically ethnic minorities, of activists from ethnic minorities and indigenous groups that take the lead. And there is a very strong impact also of the 1960s. So the youth revolt of the 1960s really revolts against this emphasis on modernization and gives more attention to culture, heritage, and diversity. And so what we see in the 1960s is a slow shift and a struggle for social and political rights through trade unions and social movements, to a struggle for collective cultural rights. And also the outcome in some cases is multiculturalism. And so probably the shift is best visible in the American Civil War, civil rights movement. So this was very strong in the 1950s and early 1960s. And what they aimed for was a stop to segregation and really assure voting rights for the Black population. So what they actually did was they aimed to integrate Blacks really into, or African Americans really into American society, the American nation. So in a way, one can argue this is a process of both emancipation and assimilation. But what happened towards the end of the 1960s is that a younger generation of activists started to emphasize Black power. So pride in their own difference, in distinctiveness. And so they started to define themselves as also having a different culture and not wanting to assimilate into the essentially middle-class Protestant white identity of the United States. And a similar shift we also see in Canada, where there was the problem of Quebec. Quebec wanted political autonomy or maybe even independence. And in the early 1970s, Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister, gave big concessions to Quebec. So they got political autonomy, the right to have their own education system, and even France became one of the official languages of Canada, so also outside of Quebec. But Trudeau did not just give these concessions to the Quebecois, but also to the Native Americans and to immigrant communities. So Canada officially adopted a policy of multiculturalism, and this already happened in the early 1970s. And so in the rest of the world, we see very similar shifts taking place. In Latin America, we see a strong emancipation of indigenous populations, and their emancipation process went through trade unions and civil associations, so basically fighting for equal rights first, but then really focusing more on protecting their own heritage, on the right to have their own education in their own language, and even to use customary law. So very much focused on collective cultural rights rather than political or social rights. And in Europe, in the 1970s, we also see a shift towards devolution, which started in Belgium in the early 1970s. Spain followed in the early 1980s, and the United Kingdom in the 1990s. So also here we see a shift to more collective cultural rights. But the breakthrough moment of identity politics really was, as I already argued, 1979. And so it's not just the 1960s that was very important, but it's also the impact of the oil crisis. So the oil crisis led to high inflation, high unemployment figures, low growth, stagnation, or even lagging growth, and high debts. And so this was a problem in almost the entire world. So it led to prolonged stagnation in the communist world. It led to an economic crisis in the West. And also, this is the period in which the high hopes of decolonization, so the rise of new nation states in Africa and Asia, where disappointment set in. So the hope that a development policy would bring welfare and economic growth that led to a big disappointment because it had not come as people had expected. So there's a lot of critique on this placeless modernism and secular modernization that was so dominant in the 1950s and 60s. And this is something, this reaction against secular modernization regimes is something that we see especially in the Middle East. So it's the rise of political Islam. So the activists argue that these generic policies did not take into account their cultural and especially religious traditions. And so these activists also argued that they spoke in favor of the majority, so not minorities, so not an the emancipation of a minority movement, but it is a group that argues that to represent the majority. And so 1979 is the Islamic Revolution in Iran. A few months later, terrorists attacked the Great Mosque in Mecca, and this is fiercely repressed by the Saudi Arabian regime. But from that moment on, the monarchy in Saudi Arabia decides to steer a much stricter course in being much stricter in religious issues. And their Wahhabist variant of Islam is from then on also exported to the rest of the Islamic world. And then finally, in the end of 1979 is the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan had a very weak communist regime. And the Soviet Union came to help their communist brothers, but this really backfired in the end. Afghanistan attracted a lot of fighters from the rest of the Islamic world, and so where they could fight a jihad against these atheist communists. And in the end, they brought a lot of their ideas and radical Islamic policies back to their home countries. But this is not, we see similar processes elsewhere in the world as well. So the Catholics had gone through a very progressive phase with the Second Vatican Council, but in 1978, Pope John Paul II was elected, and he was a very conservative pope, so focusing very much on traditional family values. And he also was from a Polish background, and so he had a lot of impact on the erosion of communism in East Central Europe, and especially in Poland. So also there, Catholicism became much more important in everyday life. And 1979 also is a turning point for the United States. So Jerry Falwell founded Moral Majority, a movement of evangelicals, and their goal was to become politically active, and they would have an enormous impact, especially on the Republican Party. And their program was pro-life, pro-traditional family, pro-moral, and pro-American. So really this mixture of nationalism and traditional moral values. And then at the same time, we see also the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. So the BJP party gained strength from this moment on, and they started a slow march through the institutions. And in 2014, finally, Narendra Modi gained power. But this also started in the late 1970s, so really a turning point. And interestingly, 1979 is also a turning point, the breakthrough moment of neoliberalism. So Thatcher was elected in 1979. The next year, Ronald Reagan was elected president in the United States, and both pursued a neoliberal policy as a kind of answer to the oil crisis, to the economic stagnation, to which traditional policies did not have a very good answer. And interestingly, this is also the exact same year that Deng Xiaoping started very hesitantly still the reforms of the Chinese plan, communist plan economy. So also there you see a start of liberalization of the economy and the removal of all kind of trade barriers. And so neoliberals argued that economy should be left to market forces. So Thatcher always argued there is no alternative for her economic policies. And so this meant that political debates really shifted to identity issues. And Thatcher and Reagan also participated very much in that, because both of them put a lot of emphasis on patriotism, on conservative family values as well, and on productivity. So neoliberalism and identity politics arise together and are closely interlinked. And then another consequence of neoliberalism is a new phase in globalization. And we tend to think that globalization, or the traditional view on globalization, is that globalization makes the world look more similar, but the opposite happened. We see already a kind of cultural globalization with the start of UNESCO's World Heritage List in 1975, in which countries had to define and choose their most specific, most extraordinary and striking monuments to put it on the heritage list. And what we also see is that globalization led to international competition. So branding of countries, cities, and companies was more important than ever. You had to put yourself in a market and be recognizable. And so probably a very good example of nation branding is the case of Spain, that had a dictatorship until the late 1970s and only became a democracy towards the end of that decade. And when the Social Democrats gained the elections in the early 1980s, they decided they wanted to present Spain as a modern democratic European country and also present a very cheerful face. And so they asked the avant-garde artist Joan Miró to design a new logo for their publicity campaign. And this is the Spain Everything Under the Sun campaign, which really was meant to attract tourists to Spain, but also investments and talents. We also see that cities became very active, especially building iconic buildings. And probably one of the best examples is Dubai, where they built this the Burj Al Arab, the highest hotel building with over 300 meters. And it was also the first 7-star hotel. So really, to put them on the market. But the interesting thing is that they used very futuristic architecture with a traditional form. So the building is more or less shaped in the form of a dhow, a traditional ship in the Gulf area. Interestingly, companies also had to brand themselves, so to give themselves a strong identity in the global market. And what they did often is associate themselves with their country of origin. And a very fascinating example is IKEA. So IKEA started as a cheap furniture, mass-produced furniture a company in Sweden, and so they really were extremely efficient and functionalist. So they had mass-produced furniture, therefore cheaper, but it was also already packaged, and people should transport it to their own homes and assemble it themselves. So therefore prices were much lower, and as you can see on the picture on the left, the building was also, it was a white cube, so a very functionalist building on the outskirts of the city with a big parking lot. And when they started to expand abroad in the 1970s and 80s, so profiting from this neoliberal globalization process, they decided to market themselves, to brand themselves as a typical Swedish firm. So the building, the uniforms, the bags, they're all in the colors of the Swedish flag. The food you can get in the store and in the restaurant are typical Swedish dishes or foodstuffs. The names of the products are not changed, so they're visibly Scandinavian names, and even the wood they use for the furniture is birch and pine, for instance, is Scandinavian wood only, so no German oak in IKEA. So they really present themselves on the global market as a typical Swedish firm. And at the same time, we also see that the mass media became more global in this period, and also, interestingly, deterritorialized. So satellite television crossed borders very easily, and this is even more the case with social media and internet. But internet and social media also had a very profound impact, as many of you know, and really was a stimulus to identity politics. So a fragmentation of public debate, clickbait instead of long, researched pieces, no gatekeepers. We enter in a post-truth era, maybe. Commercial interests really put emphasis on extreme opinions and emotions, so that we are stuck or glued to the television screen, or stuck on our mobile phones. The algorithm create bubbles and rabbit holes, so a tendency for radicalization. And what we also see on social media is that it takes a world divided into nation states, with each with their unique identity really for granted. So what we see is that nationalism, identity politics, and xenophobia really flourish on social media. And this really creates a kind of a very fertile breeding ground for right-wing populism. So neoliberalism caused political debates to shift essentially from socio-economic issues to identity issues. Globalization weakened states, especially the welfare state, but reinforced national identities. Identity politics is really emotional. It's about who we are, so it's very difficult to come to compromises or to cooperate across the aisle. Internet leads to simplification and polarization, so it also weakens moderate political options. So this also creates a kind of ideal environment for populist, nationalist movements. And so we arrive at a paradox. So currently in academia, collective identities since the 1980s are really seen as social construct, as maybe even quite artificial, imagined communities, and especially historians, we tend to focus very much on global connections, how everything is really connected. But in public debates, and here I'm concluding my talk, in public debates, we see that very old-fashioned conceptions of cultures and national or ethnic communities are really seen as closed-off, homogeneous, bounded units. And probably we can explain this by this shifting baseline. So the older generations that grew up with the memory of the Second World War, of a world in which imperialism was dominant, they slowly disappear. And now most of us really, we grew up in a world consisting of nation states, which really has been the dominant organization of the international order since the 1960s. And so all these new trends like neoliberalism, globalization, and identity politics favor a more culturalist interpretation of identities. And populist politicians who pretend to protect the people and their culture against outside and inside threats really thrive in this environment. So we now come to that since the 1950s and 60s, what has happened is almost the opposite. In the 1950s and 60s, nation states became very strong, but national identities were downplayed and were rather weak and were very similar as well. And now we see that nation states become weaker and weaker, whereas national identities really are played up. And lately, there are a few nationalists that really undermine the international order based on equal nation states. So this was my conclusion. So I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Erik, for this very interesting talk. It's definitely a book I'll add to my reading list. So with that being said, I would like to open up the floor for questions. So you can either raise your hand or put your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud. So I think we can start with Marco.
Thank you, Erik. I have many points, so feel free to discard and find which one you think is more interesting for you. I'm not sure whether I will be able to clearly phrase them, but anyhow, let me start with the first. Your distinction between the ethnos and the demos, I guess, is the classic distinction, the ethnic nation, civic nation, for what I understand it. But for me, there is something more in between, and it's the cultural nation that you still mention, but if I understood correctly, you put it into the ethnic. For you, ethnic and culture is the same, whereas for me, I define culture as ways of doing, and so it doesn't require necessarily a homogeneous ethnic people. People different in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, whatever you want to call it, they will still act within a given territory, a national territory, in a certain fashion that will be different from the same practice done in a different territory. Let's say I can see right away I'm Italian, I see how people engage with the public space in Italy, how people engage with the public space in the UK. So culture for me matters and is between the ethnos and the demos. So I wonder what you make of that. Chronologically, obviously, I do understand you come as an historian with a chronology, but I was a bit puzzled by, say, the nation existed in the Middle Ages. Obviously, it's a big debate, but at the same time, I wonder what you make of the fact that nations, because you, if I understood correctly, adopt more of a modernist approach. And so nations are a mass phenomenon. So even though some people, intellectual, might have had a sense of national consciousness. I mean, you might have intellectuals in the Middle Age in Italy, Dante, etc. They might refer to the Italy as a term, but because they are exactly mass phenomenon that appears with modernity, how can we really mention nations in the Middle Ages? And I wonder, because you mentioned nation as a legal construct, and I'm a bit again puzzled by this definition, because there is much more nation beyond the legal definition. I guess this comes from the fact that you adopt more of a state perspective than a people perspective. Whereas I come from everyday nationhood. For me, people matters in the way they reproduce, they engage with the nation. And the notion of affective nationalism is essential. There is much more nation beyond the legal construct of the nation. Nation is very much an affective dimension. The people, they move people. Affect is about movement, move both emotionally and physically. People are willing to fight for the nation. And then, yeah, I'm not sure I really quite understood. I think at the end you make sense of all the long list of facts that you mentioned, starting with the 1950s, Brasilia, functionalist modern planning, the turning point of 1979, and neoliberal, etc. But I'm not really sure what do you make of all of these kind of things, this long list of facts. What kind of really impact had on the idea of the nation? Did they really change what we mean by nation? Or yeah, it's just in terms of sometimes we see more strength of the nation state and less national identity, or the other way around, as you say in the conclusion. And coming exactly in terms of whether national identities might be weaker or stronger, how can we say so? On which basis can you assess measuring the weakness or the strength of national identity? Here necessarily we need to ask the people. We need to get, you know, and sometimes, particularly if you adopt that sense of banal nationalism, the nation is always in the background, although people don't mention it, but it's always there. So how can we really say the nation is stronger, national identity is stronger or weaker? Right, I guess there are too many points. I'll stop here. Thank you, Eric.
Well, very great questions. Yeah, so maybe let's start with the easiest question on the Middle Ages. So I argue against nations and nationalism as being meaningful terms before the age of revolutions. But what I discuss in this very first chapter is really the term nation was used, the term patria did exist. There were very basic notions about the existence of people, so the Italians, the Spaniards, the French. So these are issues that I discuss in this very first chapter, and I distinguish between 5 different conceptions of the nation in this period. But I also argue that social and religious identities were much more important than territorial identities in the early modern period. So that is my main argument against the anti-modernist interpretation. Yeah, maybe then the ethnos and the demos. So I wanted to avoid the civic ethnic opposition. So a good civic nationalism versus a nasty and aggressive ethnic nationalism. And so I decided to use more neutral terms, so the ethnos and the demos. I show, especially in the sections on citizenship, what the nation really means in practice. And so that particularly in the Americas, for instance, Native Americans, Blacks are largely excluded from citizenship rights, or at least from voting rights. But the same also happens to women and to young people. And in France, monks were excluded as well. And so I really look at processes of inclusion and exclusion, and that often has to do with ethnicity. But it only, I think ethnicity and race becomes much more important only towards the end of the 19th century with the rise of social Darwinism and all kind of racial theories. So the exclusion in the early 19th century and the Age of Revolution was primarily based on the idea of civilization. So only civilized people deserved the vote. What I try to do is that in each period, the way the nation is defined is slightly different, and that is what is really discussed in this citizenship part, but it is also discussed in the part on culture. So I really try to discuss also what views were dominant in the social sciences and in the humanities. So how was the nation seen and studied at the time? And so there I also show that often it was defined in cultural terms. So in the Romantic era, it's the link between language and culture and people. But in later periods, there are also all kind of racial ideas. So it's a moving concept in a sense, and this is what I try to show really in each of the individual chapters. And then your last question on weakness and strength. I think in my lecture I'm more outspoken than in the book. In the book I try to be objective and neutral, so I do not use terms like strong or weak national identities. But I almost in every chapter discuss the issue of national indifference, so the absence of national awareness. And so which part of the population would be aware, and especially which part of the population was not very aware or really even hostile to the nation, because, well, conscription, for instance, and higher taxes were not very popular in the early 19th century. So a lot, especially in the countryside, people rejected the new model of the nation state. So I do not speak in terms of weak and strong, but I really try to show the boundaries of the nation. So what people tended to identify with the nation and what people really rejected or were indifferent to them. And so the affective dimension. So I also pay a lot of attention to the banal forms of nationalism. So this is mostly in the last part where I speak about the nationalization of the physical environment. So how the living space really became nationalized. But I do not really speak a lot about affective nationalism. So I decided I wanted to write a global overview. So I do pay very little attention to individual national movement and also to individual nationalists. So I sometimes jokingly say my book is a book about nationalism almost without nationalists. So Gandhi is mentioned 4 times, but a lot of nationalists are barely mentioned in the book, and nationalist movements do not really play a big role. So that also means that the effective side of nationalism is not very prominent in the book. I think the original title was Nationalizing the People. So I wanted to show how nationalism really transformed politics, the international organization of states, but also our everyday life. And this is the basic main argument in the book. It was because the title was not translatable in Dutch. So my Dutch publisher suggested we just call it Nationalism and World History, and then Princeton was quite enthusiastic about that suggestion as well. So let's change the title.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We still have some time left. If not, I think I have another question. I was very interested in what you said in one of the slides, that in the process of decolonization after 1945, empires were sort of substituted by nation states. But first of all, they were substituted by federations and commonwealths, and then you mentioned that that failed after a while, and then the nation state became hegemonic. I was wondering if you mentioned anything in your book why that is, like why those federations and commonwealths and sort of political units failed at that time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, but it's the answer is also quite clear. So the attempt to turn these empires into more egalitarian unions failed, and I think I have one quote by Herriot, a former prime minister in the French Parliament. And so when the French plans to create a French union, what they said was, he argued that French did not want to become a colony of their colonies, so they wanted a more egalitarian union. But all decisions would still be made in Paris. And so the colonies got representation in French Parliament, and there are even a lot of nationalist politicians that became cabinet members. So Senghor, for instance, was a minister in the French government. But they would not accept real equality. And so then in 1956, France had to decide, do we participate in the European Economic Community, so the Treaty of Rome, or do we go for really economic integration with our African empire? And so then they decided in favor of Europe. And in Great Britain, the Suez crisis, equally in 1956, was a kind of moment that Great Britain did not decide, the other members of the Commonwealth, to attack Egypt, which would not have received a lot of applause, I would think, from many members of the Commonwealth. So most of these unions became empty shells in a way, and the same in federations. You see a somewhat similar process. Is that the richer parts were not very willing to pay for the poorer parts. So I adopted a phrase by Emmanuel Dallamole, who has written a beautiful book on Scottish, Flemish, Italian, and North Italian and Catalan nationalism. He called it the nationalism of the rich, and I adopted that phrase as well. So what we see is that the rich colonies do not want to fund the bill, and so they decide not to join these federations or to even leave them and go their own way. And so it is also very difficult if you already have your own territory. So there were already elections before the federations were created. So all politicians had a national power base. So it is very difficult to give up this national power base. But the interesting issue is that this federal moment, which really was a global moment, happens at exactly the same time as the European unification process starts. And so Europe is really one of the exceptions. Malaysia is another exception that survived. It's still a federation, and one could argue the United Arab Emirates is also has proven to be a success. But these are the only exceptions. So there are about 10 or 12 federations that really came to an end very quickly.
Very interesting, thank you. So I think we're running out of time. It's exactly 5 o'clock. So I'm sure that if there are any additional questions, Erik would be more than happy to answer that, maybe over email or something like that. This talk is recorded as well and will be posted on the website of the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. So if you would like to rewatch it, that is possible. Then I think the only thing left to do is thank you very much for coming and participating in this talk. And thank you very much, Erik, for giving this talk and presenting your fascinating book. And with that being said, I think we're looking forward to seeing you at the next seminar, which will be on the 22nd of May. Thank you very much, and hope to see you at the next seminar.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Joanna, for sharing. Thank you.
No worries.
Erik.